His reflections on the way Indian foreign policy has evolved used to be fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and above all, welcoming presence, and a great friend of Geopolitics department. So that being said, I also work to understand foreign policy making, and indeed the relationship between India and the United States is a good lens. Actually, that's a subfield. I'm really interested in opening what I would call the black box. The Ministry of External Affairs is also going to let us speak into and then speak about all kinds, and I had to take classes for that, in a way, give lectures, do all kinds of interactions. Similarly, there is, to keep arguing that there's no policy at all serves a certain purpose, but beyond that, I think you need policy, right? So you can take India policy as a given. But the politics of foreign policy is the process. I teach something called process and patterns of foreign policy of the United States, right? Now, foreign policy politics more complex than conventional wisdom actually suggests, because the basic patterns that you will discern, for example, there is now a recent debate about the role of foreign minister in our country. No impact at the time of Kissinger, for example. So Kissinger himself commented on him, but he writes eloquently about the inner processes of the American discipline. Now, I can give you several instances and several books that help you. One is by David Sanger, who is a journalist, and in Abbottabad. There are many, many such instances where we find through your research. So the task of a researcher is to offer the most reasonable explanation for a calculation. It was the two-level analysis David Sanger, the international relations expert, talks about, the theorist. What is the wide world and South China Sea to possibly, other things that concern you? Then came Fred Greenstein's book, Hidden Hand Presidency. It's a great book because it actually shows Eisenhower taking an evil coming back all the time. So IR is an interesting place. I mean, all kinds of things happen. And the Americans, in particular, strategically, what I see for Obama visit and how we are going to negotiate. So the argument that squarely builds about domestic politics. Does it mean both Republicans and Democrats, senators and the various agencies and the federal bureaucracy? We teach this as part of, this is a major source for us to understand, okay? That's one source of foreign policy. Many of us here have been very fortunate to visit Johnson Library, at least 3-4 of us here. And all of them, in fact, I must have been the last because I saw many pages underlined from Indian scholars, I bet, because the whole section on India is huge. And it's amazing how Johnson was more willing than one would have thought from our own reading of this PL 480 and all of that, than, Monish's work is on Johnson, isn't it? I remember, yes. So, it's amazing. The Congress was the guy who really didn't want to do anything with India. So what was the real idea? What am I saying therefore? Is through the 60s and the 70s, you had a very adversarial Congress looking at US-India relations in 3 main ideas. One, non-proliferation, one, market access, and one was the public institutions, or what you call the public financing and public kind of thing. I mean, basically economic socialism. So all these 3, and human rights was added in the 80s. These trinity of concerns, one was on human rights, one was on this non-proliferation rights, and one was on Indo, Pakistan, and various other things, plus economic market access. These 3 used to be Congress's pet, this thing. But what, interestingly, when I did this paper last month, I found new evidence. Much of the congressional readings that you'll find was actually because the leadership didn't care. The leadership of the Congress today, the real gem that I can give you, what I think is a gem, for a researcher many things happen, right? The earlier days, the subcommittee guys, in the 70s, the subcommittee was not very great. But the subcommittee guys used to run everything on India in the Congress. Today, the chairs of committees are very serious about India. And you will see the titles itself changing from the congressional hearings. Just take a note of all the titles. A review of Asia Rebalance now, there's 1 and 2, the latest. And you see all the Indian senators and congressmen and all that talking, congresswomen, Tulsi Gabbard, the Hindu woman talking. You'll be amazed at the change. And this, I thought was just now, but I saw even earlier, Larry Pressler's time and other times, when you look at the hearings, there's actually a change happening. They said we are focusing too much on China. So clearly the presidency, the executive, and the federal bureaucracy, and their grand rationale, I'll come to that in a moment, they did a different story on India. These people are doing a different story on India. In between, we see domestic changes happening. Why is domestic change so important? Because both these countries remain the basic of democracies. Their values of democracy come through periodic and regular elections, which are non-violent in nature by and large, right? Now, when there is a change, do we see changes? And you'll be amazed that bipartisanship held both on the negative times that Congress viewed India and the positive times. That's amazing. This is not the case with any other country. There's a lot of research. I have the data to prove it, so you can do the Q&A. Okay. So bipartisanship basically meant what? A domestic consensus. So we needed to then, why do I look at domestic sources? Domestic consensus, that this is a country which is useless, it's dirty, as the Chinese told us. 10 years ago, it was a stinking place, Delhi. Or he didn't say it like that, but he said it was a very bad place and it was very dirty and it had nothing. And today it's changed, he said. I'm happy to come back. We said, oh yeah. It was very interesting, how we both were squaring off. There's a Chinese person who thought he was making friendly remarks. And we were sitting and saying, how dare, So it's a kind of an explanation about how IR can really reveal the kind of biases one carries. But nevertheless, the domestic consensus meant what? To me, it meant only one thing, that the role of Indian diaspora was very low in the 70s and the 80s. The Congress continued to have a low level of leadership which articulated and decided positions, including Stephen Solar's, which we were discussing yesterday. You must be thinking that, professors in their off time do very great things. We discuss other things also. But we did discuss Stephen Solar's, who's a congressman from New York, and he was a friend of India's. And as you all know, you will come to know, I'm sure Manish and Arvind will teach you about the committee system in the United States and the Congress, which deals with both appropriations and authorizations of aid to various countries. And you need friends to have that kind of aid coming to you, especially in those days, right? So think of a lack of domestic consensus or a domestic consensus, what it means. So just saying domestic sources or data will not give you insights, you need to go deeper. The domestic consensus came about that we can treat India this way because there is no cost to pay. It's only in the 90s, and we have another PhD thesis which looked at it. And it was very interesting to find that, the activism of Indian community and the way they began to, I would say, bet on various horses or various hues. In South Dakota races, I still remember when I was there, I was asked, where will the Indians vote, etc. So I think Indian voting, Indian activism, Indian Americans' roles and the way they saw themselves in the American political system, that changed the way the Capitol Hill actually looked at the Indo-US relations. There was a change. And also there were other developments because, of course, Reagan-Gandhi visit had taken place. Rajiv Gandhi had gone on, and then of course we had the technological breakthrough because India suddenly realized we need huge injections of, what time? 5 more minutes? Yeah, okay. So this domestic sources therefore is something that, now interest groups and the news media have also played a huge role. Now, if you think presidential-congressional relations are essential to understanding the evolving contours of Indo-US relations, please also understand today the internet and the new media has given a new impetus to domestic sources. Because the most sort of convenient example is Devyani Khobragade affair. Look at how New York Times and Washington Post reported it and how our newspapers reported it. And you will see how Indo-US relations are really being seen differently in both these places. Right? But the organizing principle remains, to me, the legitimacy of these two leaderships. Why are domestic sources so important otherwise also? Because they help in making the choices. Today, if America's choice has become India, in terms of becoming the indispensable partner and the defining relationship in the 21st century made by Mr. Obama, I think we need to ask what is the domestic consensus that allows him to speak like this. First, the Congress is behind him. Two, there is a bipartisan consensus in the Congress that India needs to be more rewarded, more supported as a democracy than what we've done for China. Three, the media is aware what happens in India just as we are aware of what happens, so there is more familiarity with Indian issues. Four, the people, the diaspora of India is very important, and they are doing great things. Nuclear deal was done practically in many ways. The publicity, everything, the Congress went in was because of the US impact. Finally, it's also the India caucuses that come about in Congress, not just the Congress as a broad legislative mechanism which legislates on India every day. No, there's an India caucus which is an informal getting together of members on specific countries or issues. The largest membership today is an India caucus. It's dropped. From 180, it's come down to 135 in the last Congress. Now, for a researcher, these are interesting data. Why has it dropped? Because after the nuclear deal, there's not that much interest. India lobby said, okay, now they can manage. There's nothing great. Okay, so these are the things. So I want to end by saying several factors. How well does a leader design or take a choice depends on several factors. Okay, the first is the extent of presidential experience in managing the competing interests in his domestic part. Apart from his foreign policy experience, he needs to manage his domestic constituency. Mr. Obama is going to have this very hard to do because this is his last term. And my bet is, and I'm now going into the final part, which is Obama visit, I'm saying, apart from the personal characteristics and foreign policy experience of the individual, it is Mr. Obama's good luck that the Congress wants him to do a success story with India. So therefore, he might do things which other presidents were, hampered. There is this lobbies, I told you, there is a nuclear proliferation lobby. In India, we call them ayatollahs. See the way we express the same thing, right? It's a lobby. You just call them a lobby. No, we call them ayatollahs because they've really been so vociferous about us, and they call us cheaters. They call, it's amazing. It's an interesting study to be done. The third part of a presidential belief system, like Mr. Bush, that really made a big difference to Indo-US relations, and Eisenhower, JFK to some extent, things like that. Then the senior foreign policy advisors, and I think Condi Rice played a huge role in terms of how the President Bush and his belief on India was being seen as part of India policy. I think Condi Rice played a great role. I've met her and I think she's really something, and so did Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was seen as more favorable to India than even Mr. Obama in his first term. So this is an important part of understanding, therefore. Then there's also the lower bureaucratic levels. I don't want to take you there, but from Richard Boucher to Nicholas Burns to William Burns and others that all of you all know, you can read their statements. It's part of the sources that you need to draw. But forces outside of the government, like the social media, like our own Prime Minister using the social media to communicate, these primarily now are being seen as part of interest groups, the news media, to formulate public opinion, which is part of the democratic consensus, which then paves the way for domestic consensus. Consensus in a democracy has to be also democratic. Otherwise, it's unsustainable. I will finish, sir. So let me just end by the questions that I have. And I think Obama coming here has the biggest advantage. A, he likes to leave a legacy. B, he has a Republican Congress, which is interested in India because they said that Bush has done everything. So domestically, he has a much better support to do what he wants with India. On a positive note, and I can go into the details of it, there are 3-4 questions that we need to think about when we talk about why US and India relations, which very thoughtfully by Professor Arvind Kumar has been stated as evolving. And what are these contours? Why do we want them to improve? Can't we just manage what we have and be happy with that? Okay, think about that. Secondly, why have things really changed between us? Why? Then I think domestic sources will play a role for you. Then, have India's current needs made it in a less bargaining position with the United States? Has its current needs made it weaker, vulnerable? Fourth, is American decline, just maneuvering itself on our brains? I mean, are we really thinking that America's declining, so therefore we don't need to go with it? Think about America's decline itself as part of domestic sources. I think that again. And finally, why should domestic matter in an interdependent global world? We all know what there is to know about each other. Why should it matter? Answer to all of this is what I've spoken so far. Thank you very much, Chair, for not interrupting, and I'm really enjoying having so much time. And most of the time it's very difficult to find time, but thank you, sir. And I hope we'll do better in Q&A. If I've left out anything, I'll be able to answer in more detail. And I do hope for a lot of questions. Thank you.